a power struggle, and a family's legacy. The grandeur of an estate can often be deceiving. It stands tall and unyielding, a monument to the power and wealth of its inhabitants. But behind its towering gates and ornate walls, a very different story unfolds. A story of loyalty, tradition, and the complicated ties that bind a family together. The Deo estate, home to generations of wealth and influence, is the setting of this tale. It's a place where every stone and every room carries the weight of history. Yet, even the most seemingly unshakable foundations can crack under the pressure of human emotion. Nicholas Deo had long since left his childhood home, having built his own empire far away from the shadows of his family's grand estate. A man of ambition and success, he had conquered the world beyond the estate's walls, leaving behind the past, along with the people who had shaped his life. But when he returned to the Deo estate, it wasn't as the young boy who once ran barefoot through the sprawling gardens. No, Nicholas had come back as a husband, with his wife, Isabelle, by his side. Isabelle was everything the Deo family was not: modern, polished, and accustomed to the world's finer things. She wasn't just marrying a man. She was marrying into a legacy that, to her, seemed a bit too outdated, too anchored in tradition. From the moment she set foot inside the estate, she couldn't help but notice the differences. The high ceilings, the centuries-old portraits, the worn wooden furniture. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was a world stuck in time, unable to evolve, and that unsettled her. But there was something Isabelle hadn't counted on. Something that would stir the foundation of the Deo family more than any renovation ever could. Her presence on the estate was like a spark waiting to ignite a flame. And when it did, the consequences would reach further than she could have ever imagined. As she observed the staff, her gaze fell upon one woman who seemed out of place among the opulence. The woman who had raised Nicholas, the woman who had been more of a mother to him than his own had ever been, Mabel. She was the childhood nanny who had cared for Nicholas through thick and thin, a fixture of the Deo estate long before Isabelle ever set foot in it. The tension between Isabelle and Mabel was palpable from the start. Isabelle, in her sophisticated and detached way, looked at Mabel with indifference, as though she were nothing more than a servant, a tool of the past that needed to be replaced. Mabel, on the other hand, carried herself with quiet dignity, a woman who had given her heart to the Deo family and received little in return but respect and gratitude. But Isabelle had a different plan, one that would undermine the very values that had held this family together for generations. What she didn't understand was that her presence was not going unnoticed. The very people she sought to dismiss and belittle, like Mabel, were the ones who had built the Deo family's legacy. The servants, the caretakers, the unsung heroes who had sacrificed their lives to ensure the estate remained intact. They were not to be forgotten. And it would soon become clear that disrespecting these individuals, particularly Mabel, would come with consequences far greater than Isabelle could imagine. Nicholas, caught in the middle of his new life with Isabelle and his old ties to Mabel, was forced to confront the reality of his situation. His silence, his indifference to Mabel's suffering, had been a cowardly way of avoiding confrontation. He had married Isabelle, the woman he thought he knew, but her disregard for the people who had shaped him was something he could no longer ignore. As Isabelle began to take actions that humiliated Mabel, first with a careless spill of wine, and later with more deliberate jabs, Nicholas found himself at a crossroads. He could no longer stay silent. The facade of his perfect life was starting to crack, and for the first time, he had to choose between the woman he had married and the woman who had been his surrogate mother. In this battle between tradition and modernity, between respect and entitlement, the stakes were higher than they appeared. What would Nicholas do? Would he continue to live in the shadow of his wife's expectations? Or would he finally take a stand and defend the woman who had raised him? This is the story of how one man, caught between his past and his future, was forced to choose between loyalty to his family and loyalty to his wife. A choice that would forever alter the course of his life and the lives of those around him. The heart of the estate, between the past and the present. The Deo estate, with its sprawling grounds and towering gates, was more than just a house. It was a living testament to the Deo family's legacy. Every room had witnessed decades of laughter, Tears, celebrations, and losses. The walls seemed to hum with the ghosts of the past, their presence both comforting and suffocating. For Nicholas, the estate was his birthplace, his sanctuary in the early years of his life. It held the echoes of his childhood, the warmth of the kitchen, the comforting embrace of Mabel, and the sharp disapproval of his father. But it also carried the burden of his family's wealth, and with that came the expectation to maintain the status quo. Nicholas had left this world behind, seeking a new life, one that promised freedom and independence. But as he stood at the foot of the grand stairs once again, the weight of his return was palpable. Isabelle, however, was a stranger to all of it. This world, so familiar to him, felt foreign to her. She had only heard tales of the grand estate, but nothing could have prepared her for the reality. Her first impressions were not of warmth, tradition, or family. Instead, she saw an old house in desperate need of modernization. Her gaze swept over the estate with a critical eye, noting the dated wallpaper, the antique furniture, and the traditional way the staff moved about the house. To Isabelle, this was not a home, it was a relic, and as she observed the staff, she couldn't help but think how misplaced they seemed in such a luxurious setting. They didn't belong to this world. They were part of an older, more obedient time, a time that Isabelle was determined to leave behind. But Mabel was not just any servant. She was the heart of this household, the quiet force that had shaped Nicholas's life. Mabel had been with the Deo family long before Isabelle entered the picture, and her presence was the anchor to everything Nicholas had known as a child. To Isabelle, Mabel represented something old-fashioned and, frankly, unnecessary. She was a remnant of Nicholas's past that Isabelle wanted to erase, a figure who didn't fit into the polished world she envisioned for herself. As the days passed, Isabelle's disregard for Mabel grew more pronounced. It started with subtle jabs, comments about the decor, the staff's manners, the outdated customs. But it wasn't until that fateful dinner, when a glass of wine was spilled, that the real friction began. The spill, which could have been a simple accident, was treated by Isabelle with a nonchalant cruelty that sent shockwaves through the room. The way she looked at Mabel, the way she made light of the situation, it was as if she were reminding everyone in the room of their place. Nicholas's heart sank as he watched the scene unfold, but he did nothing. The silence between them was deafening, a silence that spoke volumes about his discomfort, his inability to stand up for the woman who had cared for him when no one else had. Isabelle's actions were deliberate, and she knew exactly what she was doing. But Nicholas, still lost in his own internal struggle, allowed it to happen. Isabelle's behavior didn't stop at that single incident. The next evening, during dinner, another glass of wine was spilled. This time, it wasn't an accident. The wine splashed across Mabel's uniform as she passed by, and the laughter that followed from the others in the room made Nicholas's blood run cold. But what was worse than the stain on Mabel's uniform was the stain on Nicholas's conscience. He had known it was coming. He had seen it building, but he had failed to stop it. Mabel, however, was not a woman who would ever raise her voice. She had served the Deo family with dignity, never once seeking recognition or gratitude. She accepted the disrespect with the same quiet grace, but Nicholas knew she was hurt, deeply hurt. The woman who had loved him like a son, who had held him after every scraped knee and comforted him after every nightmare, was now being humiliated under the very roof he had called home. As the days went on, the tension grew thicker. Isabelle continued to push the boundaries, openly mocking the family traditions and the presence of the staff. It became clear to Nicholas that Isabelle was not simply seeking a place for herself in the estate. She was trying to rewrite the rules, to force everyone into her vision of what the family should look like. But she had underestimated one thing. She had underestimated the power of family, and she had underestimated Nicholas's loyalty to the people who had shaped his life. It wasn't just about Mabel anymore. It was about everything Nicholas had come to realize. The house, the legacy, the traditions, and most importantly, the people who had been there for him. As Isabelle pushed him further into a corner, Nicholas realized that he had two choices. He could continue down this path, ignoring the pain of those who had loved him, or he could make a stand and defend the people who had given their lives to him. But that decision was not easy. Isabelle's beauty and charm had always captivated him. She was everything he had ever wanted in a partner: refined, poised, elegant. She fit the world he had built for himself. But as he watched her tear down the very foundation of his childhood, he knew something had to change. Isabelle's indifference was a reflection of the deeper rift in their relationship, a gap that had widened as she disregarded the very values he had once cherished. Nicholas began to question everything he thought he knew. He realized that his marriage to Isabelle had been built on a shaky foundation, one that had never truly understood the importance of family, sacrifice, and respect. It wasn't just Mabel who had been wronged. It was the very essence of what the Deo family stood for, and he couldn't let that go unnoticed any longer. The turning point came when Nicholas finally saw Isabelle for who she truly was. Not the charming, sophisticated woman he had married, but someone who was willing to destroy the very things that had made him who he was. And it wasn't just about Mabel anymore. It was about the respect he owed to everyone who had been a part of his life. The conflict reached its boiling point one evening when, in the midst of a formal gathering meant to introduce Isabelle to the wider family, she crossed the line one last time. Surrounded by family, friends, and acquaintances, Isabelle made a comment that cut deeper than any spilled wine. In front of everyone, she mocked the family traditions, the very people who had made her new life possible. Nicholas's blood ran cold as he saw the look on Mabel's face, one of quiet resignation. And it was then that Nicholas realized what he had to do. In that moment, Nicholas felt something break inside him. The image of his wife, standing there with a smile of indifference on her face, was the last straw. He had spent too long living in denial, avoiding the truth that had always been in front of him. He could no longer stay silent. He had to make a choice. The breaking point, a choice between family and loyalty. The evening had grown tense, like a quiet storm brewing on the horizon, and no one was sure just how much longer it would be before the storm broke. The grand ballroom of the Deo estate, usually filled with music and laughter, had turned into a stage where the players, Nicholas, Isabelle, and Mabel, were about to perform the final act of their delicate drama. As the guests mingled and the champagne flowed, a sense of unease lingered in the air, unnoticed by most but keenly felt by a few. Isabelle, ever the perfect hostess, moved through the crowd with an air of effortless grace. Her smile never faltered, and her words were always carefully chosen. She had mastered the art of socializing with ease, of blending into any environment, and she wielded her charm like a weapon. But beneath her polished exterior, something darker was taking root. Her disdain for the estate and its people, for the traditions she found so outdated, had become more than a passing thought. It had grown into an obsession, a desire to reshape everything according to her own vision. Mabel, as usual, remained in the background, observing from the periphery, ensuring the evening ran smoothly. She moved through the crowd with quiet dignity, serving guests without complaint, her face a mask of professionalism. But to those who knew her well, the cracks in that mask were beginning to show. The toll of her years of service, her loyalty to a family that now seemed increasingly hostile, had begun to wear on her. The warmth she had once brought to the estate, the steady presence she had provided for Nicholas, was being slowly chipped away by the very people she had given her life to. It was during one of those moments, when Mabel was quietly attending to a guest, that Isabelle saw her opportunity. The glass of wine she was holding, the deep red liquid that had so often been a symbol of luxury, was suddenly tipped in Mabel's direction. The spill was not accidental, no, it was a calculated move. The wine splashed across Mabel's uniform, staining it in front of everyone in the room. The room went quiet for a moment, as if holding its breath. Isabelle's voice broke the silence, her tone sweet, but laced with an unmistakable edge. "Oh, dear," she said with mock concern, her eyes glinting with something far less genuine. "How clumsy of me." The words hung in the air, sharp and cutting. Mabel froze for a moment, her expression never changing, her composure unshaken. She merely looked down at the stain, then gently reached for a napkin to dab at the fabric. Her movements were slow, methodical, as if this were just another day, another minor inconvenience to deal with. But in that moment, the humiliation was palpable. Not just for Mabel, but for Nicholas too. He had witnessed the entire scene, his heart sinking as he saw Isabelle's smug smile, the way she leaned back into the crowd with a sense of satisfaction, as if the power was shifting in her favor. The discomfort that had been building inside Nicholas now felt like a weight, pressing down on his chest. He had always prided himself on being a man of control, someone who could navigate any situation with ease. But in this moment, he felt like a prisoner in his own home, trapped between his loyalty to Mabel and his duty to his wife. It was as if time slowed down in that instant. He could feel the tension in the room, the eyes of the guests flickering between him and Mabel, waiting for his reaction. But instead of speaking, instead of stepping in to protect Mabel, Nicholas did nothing. The silence between them grew, thick and suffocating, as Mabel excused herself from the room, her movements graceful as ever despite the sting of Isabelle's cruelty. Isabelle, satisfied with the results of her little act, turned to Nicholas with a faint smile. "I do hope you're not upset, darling. It was just an accident after all." Her words were laced with a chilling sweetness, as though she were attempting to soothe the discomfort she had caused. Nicholas stood still, unable to find his voice. It was as if he had become paralyzed by his own indecision. What had happened to the man who once stood so firmly by the values of his family? What had happened to the man who had vowed to protect the people who had cared for him? In this moment, he couldn't recognize himself. His silence was not just a refusal to act, it was a betrayal of Mabel, of his family, and ultimately of everything he had once stood for. The evening passed, but the tension never truly lifted. Nicholas could feel it, like an invisible thread pulling him in two directions, one towards his wife, and the other towards the woman who had been a second mother to him. As the night wore on, he found himself retreating into the solitude of his study, trying to clear his mind, trying to make sense of the mess he had found himself in. But the truth was inescapable. He had allowed this to happen. He had let Isabelle undermine the very fabric of his family, and now it was too late to pretend he hadn't seen it. The weight of his own guilt was crushing. He knew what he had to do, but the thought of confronting Isabelle, of risking everything he had built with her, filled him with dread. Could he really stand up to her? Could he really turn his back on the life they had created together? The answer came unexpectedly, in the form of a conversation with his aunt, Marin. She had always been the matriarch of the family, the one who held everything together, even when the rest of them faltered. Her gaze was sharp, her words cutting to the heart of the matter. "You've been hiding in here all day, Nicholas," she said, her voice steady but firm. "But you can't hide from the truth forever. Isabelle's behavior toward Mabel and toward this family is disgraceful. You can't ignore it any longer." Marin's words pierced through Nicholas's defenses. She had seen through him, seen the conflict that had been brewing inside him. And she was right. He could no longer ignore the damage Isabelle was causing. That evening, when dinner came to a close, he knew the time had come. He could no longer remain silent. As the guests began to filter out, he found Isabelle, standing by the grand piano, the same smug smile still playing on her lips. The transformation in Nicholas was palpable. He had made his choice. It was time to reclaim the family legacy, to stand by Mabel, and to confront the woman he had married. With a calmness he hadn't felt in days, Nicholas spoke. "Isabelle, it's over. You will pack your things and leave." For a moment, Isabelle seemed stunned, her expression faltering. She stared at him, as if expecting him to retract his words, to back down as he had done before. But this time, there was no hesitation. There was no doubt. Nicholas knew what he had to do. "You're serious?" Isabelle asked, her voice laced with disbelief. "Yes," he replied, his tone unwavering. "I am." The silence between them was heavy, but it was not suffocating. For the first time in a long time, Nicholas felt free. Free from the weight of his indecision. Free from the false sense of loyalty that had kept him silent for so long. Isabelle was not the woman he thought she was, and the life they had built together was not the one he wanted to live. It was time to let go of the illusion. Isabelle's laughter, tinged with bitterness, echoed in the room. "You'll regret this, Nicholas. You'll regret throwing away everything we've built." But Nicholas didn't flinch. He had made his choice, and as he walked out of the room, the weight he had been carrying for so long seemed to lift. The house was still grand, still filled with history, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like home again. The resolution restoring what was lost. The morning after Nicholas made his decision to ask Isabelle to leave, the Deo estate seemed eerily quiet. The familiar hum of activity that had filled the halls for years, footsteps of staff moving, the distant murmur of conversations, the clinking of silverware, was replaced by a heavy stillness. The once grandiose and stately mansion now felt hollow, as though the air itself was holding its breath. Nicholas had made a decision, a difficult one, but it was the only choice that made sense anymore. Isabelle was no longer part of his world, and with her departure, he felt both a sense of relief and a deep sadness. He had long known that their marriage had been built on fragile foundations, held together by superficial charm and external appearances. It was only now, when it had all unraveled, that he saw the truth. Isabelle had never truly understood or respected the legacy of the Deo family, nor the people who had helped shape him into the man he had become. But that wasn't the hardest part. The hardest part was what lay ahead, how to repair the damage done to the family, especially to Mabel. She was the one who had sacrificed everything for the Deo name, who had poured her heart and soul into raising him. He had failed her, standing silent while Isabelle humiliated her. And no apology, no words, could ever fully make up for that. Nicholas knew he had to make it right. But how? The task seemed impossible. The damage had been done, not just to Mabel's dignity, but to the trust that had once been so central to their relationship. The love and respect that had existed between them had been tested in ways that Nicholas couldn't have imagined. As the sun rose over the estate, Nicholas found himself walking through the halls, retracing the steps he had taken countless times as a child. The estate hadn't changed. It still held the same grandeur, the same timeless beauty. But to him it now felt different. The walls that had once seemed so welcoming, so full of history and warmth, now felt like they were closing in on him, reminding him of the weight of his choices. He knew that the family would not be the same without Mabel. He knew that the house wouldn't feel like home again without her presence. Later that morning, he made his way to the small cottage on the outskirts of the estate, the place where Mabel had retreated after her quiet departure the night before. As he approached the door, his heart raced. Would she be willing to forgive him? Would she return to the estate, or had he lost her for good? He knocked softly, his breath caught in his chest. After what felt like an eternity, the door creaked open. There she stood, as composed as ever, but there was something in her eyes, something that told him she had been expecting this moment. She had always known that he would come to find her. But the question was, would he find the answers she needed to hear? "Mabel," Nicholas said softly, stepping inside when she motioned for him to enter. The warmth of the cottage embraced him, the scent of lavender filling the air, just like it had when he was a child. But it felt different now, bittersweet. "I need to talk to you." She gestured for him to sit at the small wooden table, her movements calm and deliberate. There was no anger in her gaze, no resentment. Just quiet understanding, as though she had already come to terms with the weight of everything that had happened. But there was also a sadness there, a deep sorrow that ran beneath the surface. It was a sorrow that Nicholas knew he had caused. "Mabel, I failed you," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "I failed you when I stayed silent. I let Isabelle treat you like that, and I did nothing. You deserved better from me, and I am so sorry." She sat across from him, her hands folded neatly in front of her. There was no need for her to speak, for Nicholas knew what was in her heart. She had always been patient with him, always understood him when no one else could. But now, the distance between them felt wider than ever. "You were always a good boy, Nicholas," Mabel said quietly, her voice soft but firm. "You were always kind and caring. But sometimes even good people lose their way. You didn't deserve what happened. Neither of us did. Nicholas swallowed, his throat tight. I should have stood up for you. I should have done something to protect you. But I didn't. And now I don't know how to make it right. Mabel took a deep breath, her gaze steady as she met his eyes. You're not the only one who has failed, Nicholas. We all have. But what matters now is what you do next. It's not about what's been lost. It's about what you're willing to fight for. Her words stung, but they also gave him hope. Hope that it wasn't too late to make amends. Hope that he could restore the bond they once shared. He had failed her in the past, but this was his chance to make it right, to show her that he valued her not just as a caretaker but as family. I want you to come back, Nicholas said, his voice steady now. I want you to come home. This house, this family, it's not complete without you. I need you here, Mabel, not just as someone who serves this family, but as someone who is part of it. You are part of this legacy, and I am asking you to come back and help me restore what I've broken. For the first time in what felt like ages, a small smile tugged at the corners of Mabel's lips. You're not asking me to come back because you need me, Nicholas. You're asking because you see what's been lost. And that's what matters. She paused, her eyes searching his, as if weighing the sincerity of his words. After a long silence, she sighed and placed her hands gently on the table. I'll come back, but only if you promise me one thing. Nicholas leaned forward, eager to hear her words. Anything. Promise me, she said, her voice firm, that you'll never let anyone, especially her, treat me like I don't matter again. Promise me that you'll stand up for what's right. For the family. For me. Nicholas nodded, his heart swelling with a mix of gratitude and guilt. I promise, Mabel. I will never let that happen again. With those words, Mabel's expression softened. She rose from her chair, walked to the door, and turned back to face him one last time. Then let's go home, Nicholas. As they walked back to the Deo estate, the morning light seemed brighter, the air fresher, as though the entire world had been renewed. Nicholas knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be challenges, there would be battles, and there would be more decisions to make. But for the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful. He had made the right choice. He had fought for what mattered. And together, they would rebuild the family legacy. Not just with wealth and power, but with love, respect, and the lessons they had learned through the pain. The Deo estate was no longer just a symbol of grandeur. It was a home again. Lessons learned. The story of Nicholas, Isabelle, and Mabel teaches us that loyalty, respect, and the value of family should never be underestimated. We often get caught up in the allure of material wealth and success, thinking that these things define our worth. But in the end, it is the people who stand by us, who care for us through the most difficult moments, that truly matter. Nicholas's journey is one of awakening, a realization that true strength comes not from silence or submission, but from standing up for what is right. In relationships, whether they are familial, romantic, or otherwise, it is essential to understand that respect is the foundation. Without it, no amount of wealth, power, or status can hold a family together. Nicholas's transformation was not just about making amends with Mabel. It was about reclaiming his integrity and his ability to defend those who matter most. This story reminds us that sometimes we must choose between holding on to what is comfortable and standing up for what is just. And when we do, we may just find that the bonds we have neglected can be rebuilt stronger than ever.